IVM.
Traditions bind the world and society around us. How can we think about them better? What might we be missing while calling for reforming traditions? Traditions that pose a variety of challenges to a modern society, and that too within a republic. AP Ashwin Kumar returns to episode 151 of the Pragati Podcast to take us beyond simplistic notions of tradition and reform. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Learning Futures and a member of the faculty at Ahmedabad University. As with our episodes from 143 onwards, this is a rich episode with in-audio links, references, and polls. Listen to the episode on the IVM Podcast Android app, the Adori iOS app, or on your browser to get the full experience. Head on over to tiny.cc/Pragati151. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We take a step back from noisy political debates and dive into rich conversations on India and the world. I am your host, Pavan Srinath. We'll start this episode's conversation after a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel. So Justine Royal came on Storytellers and Storytellers this week with Vineet. It was a really interesting conversation. Do definitely check that out. Hamsini Hariharan is back on the Pragati Podcast after an extended absence. Hamsini was one of the original hosts along with Pravan, but she was unable to continue. But we're glad to have her back. She's talking about her experiences since she left. She's been studying in China. Definitely check that out. You'll enjoy that. On Pulyabazi, they discussed the Revolution of 1857 as seen from contemporary eyes. Definitely give that a shout. I think you'll love that as well. Abhijit Ganguly was on Cyrus Says a couple of weeks ago, and he had such a great time, and we were so happy to have him on that we asked him to join us for Cocked and Bull, and he was on this week. Do check that out. And lastly, I'd like to mention our Tamil show. We've been doing a show called Kadai Podcast Ponniyin Selvan, hosted by Kavita Jiva. She has been phenomenal. She's rewritten the stories in a way which really, they speak to a modern audience. But Ponniyin Selvan is over, and she has started a new story, though. The new story that she started is Sivakamiyan Sabatham. I'm sure I mangled that pronunciation, and I'm sure you'll love it if you're a Tamil speaker. Do definitely check it out. And with that, let's get you onto your show.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to the Pragati Podcast. Today we have Dr. AP Ashwin Kumar returning to the Pragati Podcast. He was here last on an episode on nationalism, India and the West, titled Questioning Nationalism. Dr. Ashwin, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Pavan.
Ashwin, we seem to have created a mini tradition of our own, which I hope to continue, which is that we are talking about these things both in Kannada and in English. So even our previous episode on nationalism, we had one on Thale-Harate and one on Pragati. And I think both are complementary discussions rather than repeated discussions. And I hope to follow that in our conversation today, where we recently had an episode on Thale-Harate on tradition and reform. And I hope to have a complementary conversation on that in English today.
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting model that we might be setting up here.
Yes, and I've read so much about the bilingual Indian intellectual tradition. And as someone who has actually learned more Kannada as an adult than earlier, to me it is endlessly fascinating because a lot of my thinking might still happen in English rather than Kannada as a prior.
Right.
So, Ashwin, I want to talk to you today about what tradition is, what it constitutes, and spend some time dwelling on that before we come to ideas around reform. Because many people might frame the problem as that many of our traditions are either toxic or irrelevant or problematic and are hampering social progress and equity and various goals that we see for society. But as you actually mentioned on Thale-Harate, we don't spend enough time on thinking of what tradition is. So today I want to do justice to that in English as well. And I want to maybe have you start off by telling us about how to even start thinking about tradition.
Sure. I think broadly, if you were to look at the received ways of talking about tradition, we think of traditions as social facts, right? Like there is the state, like there are the laws and there are various social mechanisms. There is also tradition, which means we think of traditions as objects to be explained. by and large, then the questions will become within this paradigm of explaining the tradition. Questions will be asked about, so what is the origin of this tradition? What is the mechanism by which this tradition perpetuates or brings in new people into its fold? What is the purpose that this tradition is meant to serve? And underlying all of these questions, what are the interests, probably ulterior motives, that this tradition is trying to conceal? These are the kind of questions we ask about traditions. If you were to look at the tradition as an object requiring an explanation. So broadly call this an explanatory view of tradition.
Right.
There is also another view of tradition which does not have great standing in the academic or intellectual thinking about the tradition, but it has a great vibrancy in the people who participate in specific traditions, people who are part of specific traditions, which is to see traditions as learnables. That is, see traditions as something you can learn and learn from. So one of the things you would ask as a participant in a tradition would be not why does this tradition exist or where does this tradition come from, but how do I follow this correctly? Or given a certain situation where I am supposed to do this according to some tradition, but I'm not able to do this, how do I compensate for it? So in a way, there is a certain attitude of learning by which you look at traditions. So broadly, you can say traditions can be seen as explainables or they can be seen as learnables.
And perhaps similarly, tradition as like objects versus practices, right? Or something that you can practice rather than a practice that you observe.
Yeah, that's correct. So this object, I would rather use the term versus for the time being. It might not always be a versus, but object versus practice view and explanation versus learnables view. There is a certain priority to the objects and the explainables view in the received sociological, anthropological, and social scientific tradition, which talks about traditions. What we need to be able to do is to try and see how to bring in this other half, the half of learnables, the half of practices and actions into the talk about traditions. So that's largely the way I would look at it.
Thanks, Ashwin. And here, what you say makes so much sense and so much apparent sense when the moment we stop thinking about society, right? The moment we start thinking about, say, the traditions of science or the traditions of evidence-based experimental research, we think about the practice first and we think of them as learnables first and as objects second, right? It's in fact the sociologists who look at the traditions around science and research more as objects than as learnables.
That's so true. I think, this might be unfair to the sociologists, but I can't stop myself from saying something like the same problem that a scientist would have towards a sociologist of science is what most practitioners of specific traditions would have towards sociologists of tradition. But the general idea that we need to be able to pursue is to see what are the implications of making this claim. What are the implications of saying that traditions have to be seen as learnables, that they cannot be, or make it a slightly more modest claim. Looking at traditions through the sociological perspective does not exhaust the scope of the tradition itself. That is the idea we need to sort of, add more flesh and blood.
So Ashwin, could you use perhaps a science, physics or a research example to help us understand that a little bit better?
So take the instance of the debates around the heliocentric and geocentric theories of the universe. There is a certain way in which we have now received a particular picture of this theory, right? That of this entire story of the shift from the geocentric to the heliocentric universe, into the heliocentric world model, if you want. That story is the story of there being a vested interest in the geocentric universe because it establishes the primacy of the Christian church, and there's a conflict between the anti-rational, superstitious or dogmatic church versus the enlightened, scientific-minded few who were these fringe figures fighting for truth and so on and so forth. Now, this is just but one way of looking at the story. Recently, I was reading a French historian of ideas called Fernand Halen, who, in his book, The Poetic Structure of the World, gives us a startling insight, a very different take about this picture. He says the primary movers of the shift from the geocentric to the heliocentric universe was not some kind of, an incipient scientific perspective or a will to truth or anything like that. What was really happening was across various fields like architecture, music, poetry, engineering, theology, and painting, certain core ideas are coming into the fore. What are these core ideas? Ideas of harmony, symmetry, and proportionality.
Okay.
Now, this is seen in church building. Church building now takes a new kind of a shape where the architectural salience is on ideas of harmony, symmetry, and proportion. Music, the new symphonies focus more on harmony and symmetry and proportion. So also with painting, the entire notion of the three-dimensional vanishing point with the harmony. And remember the Vitruvian man and even Da Vinci's idea of dividing man by making man the measure and creating harmonies between different components of the human body. Your finger is so many times your palm, and that is so many times your arm, and so on and so forth. Now, across the board, these values are coming into the fore, and astronomers are probably one of the last set of people to be joining this bandwagon. And slowly, a few of them start asking, the Ptolemaic calculations, the Ptolemaic grid, it's fine, but it somehow seems to violate the principles of harmony, proportion, and symmetry in exactly the way that it's not being violated in these other fields that are coming about. And that is when the astronomers start saying, okay, what would be the most harmonious way of getting these calculations in place? What is the most proportional way and what's the most symmetrical way?
Okay.
And one of the candidates is, of course, the heliocentric universe, which creates the best solution for this demand. Now, this is exciting, right? Look at what's happening here. It is a certain internal movement within the tradition of astronomy, which is really driving this change. If not, it seems like the heliocentric universe idea is simply a found object. Accidentally, someone came across this truth and everyone said, okay, from today, this is going to be the truth. And there were bad people who were not accepting it. And finally, the bad people were defeated. That seems like a schoolboy notion of what science. It doesn't give a sense of the internal dynamic of how this tradition would have evolved.
Right. I mean, that was just one aspect, right? I mean, Galileo being able to see the Galilean moons of Jupiter made it possible for someone to see specks of, dots orbiting around another dot.
Yeah.
Right? And that was not possible earlier, but that is not a sufficient explanation for how the science shifted.
Correct. That's correct. So, in a way, seeing changes as some kind of an organic development within a tradition is historically, sociologically, a much more challenging job than retrospectively, marking with some milestones, some kind of radical shifts, and giving some kind of a symptomatic ideological narrative about why these shifts did not happen before their time. Literally, the received story about Galilean and the Copernican model is that if this was true, why didn't people know it 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago? Well, people didn't know it because there was a force which was stopping them from knowing it. Now, this is a little bit of a caricatured history of science.
At the same time, it doesn't take away from the idea of dogma, right? I mean, there might have been dogma, and dogma always plays a role in all traditions.
Correct. And that's most often it's a constitutive part of any tradition, that you have to have a certain core assumption around which you start working, right? And that's true even for modern day scientific thinking also.
Right.
You may not want to call it dogma, but at least if you were to go by Tosian model of understanding science, he would say there is a negative core to the science which has to be always protected, which should never be attacked despite factual data which contradicts it. If there is factual data contradicting the negative core, the central hypothesis of your program, you will have to either alter the fact, create some kind of a protective belt, create corollaries and so on and so forth, and deflect that challenge of the fact and not compromise on the negative core itself. If you start compromising on the negative core, two things happen. One is the tradition starts withering away. But if you say, well, why do you want to protect a tradition? If it wants to wither away, let it wither away. That's a valid position to take probably. There's another thing that happens, which is if you don't protect the negative core, you don't know what is the cognitive progress you have achieved. You don't know whether what you have been working for is a coherent set of propositions and a coherent theory, or are you just like, hurtling from one thing to the next? It's almost like,
Sorry, could you explain the idea of the negative core a little bit?
So if you were to look at scientific research in the form of programs, there's a Newtonian program, there's an Einsteinian program, or there's a quantum program. Now, a program, how do you define a program? Now, Lakatos, I think he's a Hungarian mathematician turned philosopher of science. And so Lakatos says a research program has two things. It has a core set of assumptions, which forms its intellectual nucleus, as it were.
Right.
For the Newtonian system, probably some of those assumptions about the discreteness of matter, the continuous motion, those three laws, some 3 or 4 of these form its core.
Right.
Now, this is something which is a non-negotiable. That is, if any of these things are challenged, then the entire program falls apart. There's nothing else left in the program to make it coherent.
Right. So in the sense that, if you're thinking of a world before Einstein and others, you're saying it's the idea that unless we agree that, force is equal to mass times acceleration, we can't work together on Newtonian mechanics.
Correct.
If we don't even agree on that, then you can't do any Newtonian mechanics.
Yeah. So
right.
Whatever else you may do, it won't fit into this scheme. So
right.
It's completely unintelligible. You may understand it using some other mechanism, but it is strictly speaking unintelligible within this program.
Right.
What's also important is one of its consequences for Lakatos. He says, from out of this core, sort of radiates, if you want, from out of the negative core, certain positive heuristics and hypotheses. So these can be changed. The protective components of the research program, the heuristics, the assumptions, the corollaries, all of these can be changed and altered time and again.
Right.
But all of these are changed and altered in order to protect the core itself. And this you have seen in various examples after examples. The latest being the example of Chomskyan linguistics, where despite the mounting evidence of other kinds of linguistic data on how language is acquired and how languages work, different kinds of languages work, the Chomskyan paradigm has been trying to protect the negative core by making it more and more minimalist, more and more narrow, and less ambitious. But it's important to maintain that core. People accuse Chomsky, for instance, of being a little bit of a fundamentalist when it comes to his linguistics. He may well be one, I don't know. But what he's doing within this Lakatosian framework seems to be perfectly reasonable thing that a person within a tradition would do, which is protecting its negative core.
So, Ashwin, to go back to this idea where we started, where you talked about the pursuit of symmetry and, the progress in physics and astronomy as a science, we see certain reflections of that even to this day, right? Physicists still have this grand ambition of the grand unified theory, and it's the symmetry in that which is attractive to a lot of people, right? In creating this one grand model of the universe and how it works. And so that pursuit seems to have carried it over from 16th or 17th century even to this day. So in that sense, people can argue that the same tradition has continued.
Correct. The same tradition has continued, and there may be spawning of sub-traditions, certain branches out of it, and so on and so forth. But there is a strong case to be made about the unity of the pursuit of physics as a tradition.
Right. So Ashwin, then going back to our first sort of your assertion about this object view of tradition and the learnables view, this feels like the received story that we have about Galileo and the church and so on was an improper object view of what happened in physics, and perhaps this idea of the pursuit of symmetry is a better object view of what might have happened, but it's still different from the learnables, right? I mean, people might have pursued symmetry and elegance and other things, but they would have still done certain customs and rituals in the practice of that physics. Right? So in that way, it still goes back to, okay, if I want to be a good scientist, I will learn ABC tools, I will follow ABC systems, I learn about how other people conducted certain experiments and analyses, and I will try to emulate them in what I study. That still becomes the core of the learnables of that tradition, right?
Correct.
So how do we apply that back now to society and to social traditions?
Right. Well, probably the first difference we need to mark off when we are talking about social traditions as against scientific traditions is might not be methodological strictures to pursue a specific hypothesis. That is not what you're doing. You might be pursuing something else. You might be pursuing forms of good life, or you might be pursuing desires which are worthy of pursuit, or desires which have been established as appropriate for you to pursue over hundreds of years. Now, the fundamental change in perspective that we really need to be trying to effect here is to say, how do you look at the actions in a given domain as constituting that domain, and how do you look at the moment you start looking at actions, you're looking at a sense of judgment and appropriateness, right?
Right.
This is a crucial component in looking at something as a learnable. That is, again, going back to one of my favorite examples of the fire ritual, the Vedic yajna that Fritz Stahl talks about, for instance. Stahl says, when someone's performing fire ritual, they are interested in figuring out how exactly is something done. They're not interested in figuring out what is the symbolic meaning of this activity. Now, you can give any amount of symbolic meanings to this activity, or you can remove them, but that doesn't affect the core issue. Now, let's say, supposing you're supposed to take water around the sacrificial fire altar 3 times. Now, no one asks, why should I do it 3 times? One is only concerned about whether is it okay for me to circumambulate clockwise or anti-clockwise.
Okay.
This is important because you should not be circumambulating it one way and you should be doing it some other way. Now, what are we saying when we are saying this? This close attention to the constitutive rules of an action is what it is to look at something as an action domain. Now, it might not always be in the form of constitutive, well-defined constitutive rules, like in the examples of ritual and the example of science. The constitutive rules may be somewhat understated or they might be implicit or very tacit. But discovery of these constitutive rules is what socialization into specific traditions really is about. And we keep discovering these rules as we grow up. We are taught these rules as we grow up. And rules might be a harsh phrase here. We are taught these ways of going about things as we grow up.
Then how do we look at this learnables view when we are talking about something that is not as clear-cut or something that is perhaps more controversial, right? So for example, I know that, say, on Thale-Harate, we took the example of child marriage. We can take the example of, say, sati or something else. And those of us who are looking at it today don't just follow whatever the religious traditional systems, but also modern traditions, right? Of liberty, of the pursuit of, secular spaces, of human rights, of other things. So how do we even begin to think about some things which are quite problematic?
So you see, This response will be deeply unsatisfactory at one level, but one has to sort of somehow wrap one's head around this. The unproblematic practice, or let's put it this way, the problematic practice is really of a piece with the explanatory model. Now, I'm not saying sati or child marriage is an unproblematic practice if you look at it some other way or something like that. No, not at all. I'm just saying if there is a received tradition, you receive it by treating it as a learnable. And the question of whether it is morally a justified tradition or not never comes into play at all. It comes into play when you are trying to evaluate the tradition. Now you might say, so what should be our attitude in relation to, let's say, child marriage or sati? There's a very, very interesting thing. You don't need to have an attitude there at all because you cannot reframe it as a justifiable action. You can only see it as an action with negative consequences, which means there is no perspective from where you can look at these practices as good. Therefore, the question of rendering them learnable does not arise at all. However, there is something else that is the matter, which is this, that you can for the time being keep away the question of whether a practice is good or bad. You can still ask what is a learnable from a given practice, even if it is a bad practice, even if you consider it to be a bad practice. Why is that so? Because you have to at least allow for a fundamental distinction. The distinction between, let's say, put it this way, a decision or a context of decision and a context of deliberation. The context of decision requires you to decide whether you shall have sati or not have sati. The context of deliberation, however, requires you to say, what are all the different ways in which I can understand this particular phenomenon? What are all the different knowledge gains that is possible in my engagement with this phenomenon? I can, for that moment, keep the moral judgment aside completely legitimately. Now, you might say, but isn't the moral judgment really the point? Well, the moral judgment is really the point, but it's a very obvious point, right? Because you bring your entire moral formation into play and no one knows what is the nature of one's own moral formation. It's a very, very contingent thing. You bring your entire moral formation into play, and when you look at sati, you feel it's abhorrent. There is nothing more to that story than that. There is nothing more to be done about this fact. If you're feeling it's aberrant, it's aberrant. I can't convince you out of it. I can't argue you out of it. What I can, however, do is to say, in the decision realm, I do understand the nature of your abhorrence. But as an investigator, as someone understanding traditions, I would want to invite you into another paradigm. The paradigm not of decision, but the paradigm of deliberation. Here, you cannot bring the attitude of decisions onto the table because the deliberation paradigm is a logically different paradigm than the decision paradigm. Even so much as maintaining a semblance of this distinction is really going to take us a long way in understanding tradition.
Okay. So here, Ashwin, then, I mean, I'm probably jumping the question because I want to spend a little more time on it later. But if we're talking about reform, change, evolution, progress, I mean, pick the word, right? Usually, I mean, you can argue that social reform or the pressures for social reform, at least in modern India and elsewhere, come from without, right? So there is someone who's following the practice of, say, child marriage in their community or in their family, and there's somebody else from the outside who's saying, no, this is violating the fundamental rights of the children who are being married off, and under the force of law and under the force of human rights and our constitutive rights and so on, we shall do something to stop or prevent this practice from happening. Outside of that, is there any other way to think about reform, change, or those questions from within such a tradition?
Right. I think one is to make a few distinctions here. One is that specific customs and traditions may be questionable. may be something you can't accept. But our criticism of these traditions and customs have to be, in a way, circumscribed by certain caution, certain care and attention to certain limits of what should be a rational criticism. So let's rephrase it this way. There are significant limits to the rational critique of traditions, and we need to be careful about not overstepping those limits. And here are some limits one would want to talk about.
So Ashwin, are you saying that, say, if we look at a practice like child marriage, and if I were to give an explanatory view of that and saying that Indian society has a history of patriarchy, which has resulted in something like child marriage being made possible because you have the patriarch of the family who will take decision on the behalf of others, and you're not endowing people with agency. Right. Would you say that this critique needs to be qualified a lot more?
I think this needs a lot more qualification. Even if you were to continue being uncomfortable with child marriage, even if you were to continue banning child marriage, the nature of this critique is slightly insidious. It is not putting all its cards out. I'll tell you what's the issue here, the way I see it. There are certain undesirable consequences to child marriage in terms of the reproductive health of girls, in terms of the health, the general health of the offspring, in terms of the gender relations between boys and girls who are married at a very early age, and so on and so forth. Now, if I were to say that let us take care of all the negative consequences of child marriage, and then would you be okay with a practice like child marriage? I'm sure our answer is no. No matter what you do with child marriage, however you tweak it, we are not accepting a practice like this. Now, why are you not accepting a practice like this? Well, because this practice violates some of our fundamental philosophical commitments about what is it to be human beings. Right. And what are these kind of commitments? Well, notion of free will, choice,
agency, consent,
bodily integrity, so on and so forth. Which means,
and these are all non-negotiables, right? I mean, these cannot be compromised on.
These are non-negotiables and cannot be compromised on. But remember something, the nature of this critique of this specific practice has now suddenly taken a different shape. It has become a foundational critique of a specific practice, and not what I would call, in contrast, an ordinary critique of a specific practice. Now, the foundational critique of traditional practices at some level is basically saying, okay, here are my set of non-negotiables, and everything that doesn't fit in will have to go away. But if you dig deeper, it is doing something much more injurious. What is a foundational critique doing? The foundational critique is saying that any practice is justifiable only insofar as they are in line with specific fundamental principles. That is, my set of fundamental principles are now the yardstick against which I am going to measure everything else in the world. Now you might say, yeah, so what? What is the problem with having such a fundamental set of principles? There is a problem. And the problem is of this nature. I was recently reading a book called Idolatry and the Colonial Idea of India, and various other people have also made comments about this. The Christian missionaries and the Orientalists had a critique of non-Western traditions, pagan traditions, heathen traditions, and so on and so forth. And the critique was that they were idolatrous. Yeah? What is the crux of calling something idolatrous? Your Hindu practices and various other practices that you find, these African tribal practices. These are all idolatrous. Idolatry is a certain parochial, to use their words, a certain parochial obsession, a certain parochial arrest into the contingent facts. That is, you are arrested into this particular stone as being your God. You are arrested into this particular practice as being holy, instead of making your practice universal and abstract. The Christian faith is both universal and abstract because it is not determined by any parochial instantiations. This particular stone is not God. This particular building is not God's own abode. No. You can abstract out from all of this and create notion of your tradition or the Christian religion rooted in purely universal ethos and principles. Anything that doesn't match this is idolatry. This was the elevated understanding of idolatry. This is idolatry
in that era.
In this era too, if you were to listen to someone who would want to make such an argument. Like say, for instance, the Archbishop of Canterbury recently made this comment about him not wanting to attend a summit of religions. He said the assumption behind an interfaith dialogue is that all these faiths are somewhat of equal footing. But that is completely false. I mean, that would be false to me as a Christian because the Christian religion is not one more true faith. It is the one true faith. Now, you have to take this point seriously because it is the one true faith. Now, whether you agree with it or not, or whether I agree with it or not is a separate issue. But from the perspective of a practicing Christian, it is the one true faith. And why is it the one true faith? Not because of some dogmatic belief in some parochial ideas established in the Middle East 2000 years ago. No, because I can derive this faith from my first principles, from completely universal principles, and abstract it from out of every single parochial practice. Now, the liberal, rational critique of traditions is a perfect parallel mirror image of the Christian critique of idolatry about other traditions. Both of them are demanding the same thing. Both of them are demanding that you reconstitute all these practices from first principles, which are universalizable and which are rational. What do we mean by rational? True by a particular theory of first principles.
And reasoned thereafter.
And reasoned thereafter by that particular method. Now this is, I think, both very ambitious and a very distorted understanding of any practice, never mind traditional practices. It is false in so many different ways. Now, if you were to try to do this, forget about child marriage and sati and all of these kind of practices. If you were to make such a rationalist's demand on scientific practices, scientific disciplines, even then you're going to end up in very bizarre results. You know, you just mentioned the grand unified theory of the physicists. There is also the second hovering idea, right? The grand unification of the sciences, which seems to be an even more bizarre idea. Because you want to say that there is something called, for want of a better term, scientificity, which is absolutely universal and abstract, and every single scientific practice can be derived as special instances of that scientificity. Well, no, the history of science has proved beyond doubt probably that that's a pipe dream not going to happen anytime soon. It's just a wild goose chase with some wrong metaphysical assumptions. The same questionable metaphysical assumptions are what underlie the liberal rationalist critique of traditions. When you were to say, okay, here is sati, here is child marriage, you will have to defend them by the rational principles of human societies and human traditions that I'm going to establish prior to our discussion. Sorry, that doesn't exist.
Thank you, Ashwin. So let's take a quick break and we come back and then let's talk about what would be a realistic way to at least get rid of certain overtly horrend or bad practices that should not exist and should not make people's lives difficult, right? And then let's also talk about how traditions and other things can evolve thereafter.
Sure.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कुटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm here talking to AP Ashwin Kumar about tradition, and we're also going to be talking about reform and how we can square the two. So Ashwin, you were making the case quite forcefully about how we cannot be universalist in our critique or in our rational critique of traditions. And in fact, we might be committing the same sins, pun not intended, as Western scholars or Western thinkers who were looking at idolatry in the 19th century and even in the 20th century as an abhorrent practice which does not square with their principles. So while I take your point, how do we then actually confront social evils that might be stemming from traditions? How do we deal with specific challenges of say widespread caste discrimination, things like child marriage, other institutions which are deeply problematic and are causing a lot of harm in society?
So here is something that one should try to develop as a certain discipline in responding to this, which is try to articulate the harm, the consequential harm of these practices in as minimalist a way as possible. And if such a case can be made, well, by all means, one can go ahead and say that this practice cannot be accepted or that practice cannot be accepted. Now, once you begin doing this, you will notice that the picture becomes far more complex and the room you have to maneuver becomes far more restricted. And that's a good thing. For instance, the only thing you can say about sati being a bad practice is that it results in the involuntary death of a person and therefore it amounts to murder. And that is the only reason why it is wrong.
Right.
And the rest of the practice you have carefully avoided from making a comment on in this format. Now, you may want to still write a history of, why such a practice exists, in the object mode that we were talking about, in the object explanation mode that we were talking about. And you may still want to say what are the historical causes for such a practice to exist and all of that. But your judgment itself has to separate out these two levels. That is, sati is an unacceptable practice only insofar as it involves cognizable crime,
right,
amounting to a murder of a person, of a woman.
Right.
Now, beyond that, all other discussions have to happen within the deliberative framework and not in the decision framework. The rest of it is not available for decision. Now, why am I arguing for this seemingly super subtle, almost bordering on the sophistic kind of a distinction? Well, if you take this distinction, if you take this care of making this distinction seriously, you will notice that various other practices about which we have been going about making, decisions of banning things and so on and so forth cannot be made so easily. You cannot make the same kind of claim that you made about sati in the case of, say, the madesnana, that is the rolling over leftover food, or the Shabarimala, or various other practices that exist. When it comes to these other practices, you will notice that the progressive rationalist critique seems to have a disproportionate advantage over positions of tradition itself. And this disproportionate advantage is something which is not to be given to anyone, including the liberals.
Okay. So you're saying there has to be strong evidence of evident injury,
yes,
then as a principle. Like, I think that's something that you've even written about in a former op-ed of yours, right?
That's correct. I think we should probably bring that in at this stage. Now, my example for this is the case about Shabarimala. Now, look at that case. Only thing we should be really talking about is there an injury, social, economic, psychological, whatever, is there an injury to women as a consequence of not accessing that shrine? This is the one question, for some reason, no one's talking about. Everyone's saying why the specific tradition is a symbol of patriarchy, is a symbol of misogyny. And that is why we need to ban it. And there should be absolute equality of treatment. And no one's talking about whether, as a consequence of the ban on women's entry, are women suffering any social, psychological injury or not? This is the question we should be asking. And if you are carefully attending to the nature of these traditions, you will notice that it is meaningless to talk about these traditions in a language where women not accessing this tradition, this temple, are suffering a social or any other form of injury. No practitioner or no participant in the Ayyappa Swami tradition thinks that the woman who has not been given access has therefore been made into a lesser person or something like that. Men don't think so, women don't think so, no one else thinks so. Whereas that's not the case if you were denied a civic right of education. Let's say if women are denied civic right of education, as a consequence, women suffer injury. As a consequence, you and I, the better educated, will treat them in a disadvantaged way, in a way disadvantageous to them. And that is a specific social injury. You might want to further argue that, oh no, the injury is not at this level, the injury is at a psychological level. That also cannot be a subjective argument. The psychological injury argument has to be both intelligible and plausible to the community of believers who are part of that tradition. That is, women who have traditionally been from communities which have accessed the Ayyappa Swami shrine should have suffered psychological injury as a consequence of not accessing that tradition. There must be some empirical evidence for that. Impossible to make that claim. The ouonly way you can make this claim of injury is by making a foundational critique that traditions ought to be representatives of specific truths we have derived from certain universal principles, and anything which does not map to that universal principle ends up becoming an idolatrous practice. And idolatry is harmful for your soul, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, whether you have suffered it or not. It is harmful for your soul because consequentially, eventually, you're going to suffer its consequences. And therefore, now you might say, oh, well, we are not talking in the language of idolatry. We are not talking in that language. We're talking in a fairly enlightened, rationalist language. Well, you're not talking that language, but the structure of your argument seems to be mirroring it, and you're not being careful enough about it.
Ashwin, the second problem that I see here is also something that we see a lot in Indian society, which is that not only are we making this argument, but then we are taking a legal route and a legal solution to this social challenge, right?
Yeah.
And it is being framed in legalistic ways, and then we are asking the courts to decide on this. And that has its own consequences. But if we take this judgment view of this away and say that, no, this can be a topic of deliberation or discussion, be it in Sabarimala temple entry or in some other social practice, where does that begin? So does one have to show injury for that to begin? Or how do you see that kind of a deliberation resulting in a tradition changing or evolving in a certain way?
Now, at some level, it's in the nature of tradition that it is not a static entity. Because if it were to be a static entity, it would map onto specific foundational principles. Our entire claim has been that it does not map onto any specific foundational principles, and therefore, as a consequence, it will not be a static. So traditions do evolve, do change, and things like that. But over and above that, there may be any number of objections, complaints about a tradition. from any number of constituencies. We may not even know how a given tradition might be hurting or harming some person or some group of people. One does not need to obliterate that aspect at all. What one needs to do is to say, given that someone's raised a claim of injury, there are certain ways by which this argument has to happen. The argument cannot happen in a way that it challenges the very principle of existence of specific traditions. I'll give you an example. Take the Sabrimala instance. The Sabrimala instance, the strong progressive argument, the rationalist argument is that there should not be discrimination on the basis of gender.
Right.
Now, this argument is not only about the Sabrimala temple, right? It's potentially extendable to every single traditional practice that you have in the society. So, for instance, there are all these various religious bodies like the mathas and that. And some of these mathas of many hundreds of years have men usually being the pontiffs or the head.
Yeah, there are gender and caste-based entry barriers, to positions of power.
Yeah. Now, supposing you were to extend this argument and say that the next head pontiff of a specific matha in this country, either Puri or Udupi or Hubballi, wherever these big mathas are, has to be a woman or has to be from the caste which is not the caste of that specific tradition. Now, what are you doing really? You might think, okay, you're bringing in a culture of equality, but you might also be making a foundationalist, fundamental argument that all of these traditions will have to now be reconstituted by the principles of a certain universal liberal scheme. Basically then, you're saying that other ways of organizing social life have no legitimacy. Other ways of organizing traditional life have no legitimacy. That seems to be bizarre because remember, the liberal program was to ensure that certain conceivable, certain apparent harms that either state or traditions impinge on you are avoided. The liberal program is not a liberal theology. A liberal theology would say, let us change the world to be a better place according to these principles. No, that is an extreme reading of the liberal program. The reasonable reading of a liberal program is to say, here are the principles which shall form the basis of resolving any conflict. Yeah? So this minimalist reading of the liberal program is what we seem to have lost sight of in this entire debate. I should also probably bring another angle here, which is, showing that there is an unjust cause to a practice is not grounds enough to ban that practice, because you will have to show unjust consequences. The unjust causes are not sufficient grounds to ban a practice. And we discussed this example. I would really want to bring it again here, which is of the American Electoral College. The American Electoral College can be probably argued that's an institution which is based in a history of racism and slavery and so on and so forth. Now, it's another issue whether that's a full picture or not, but there are many people who make that argument. Now, the cause of this practice, the American Electoral College, might be racist, but that is not grounds to abolish the practice. You will have to give us another set of separate arguments which show that the consequences of this practice is racist. If you can show that, then maybe there is reason to question the American Electoral College. Similarly, with all of these traditions, you may want to argue with some sociological, historical perspective that the root of these practices and traditions are in patriarchy, in casteism, in any number of other heinous schemes that you think exist. And you may very well be correct also. But that is not grounds to legislate against the practice. The only reasonable grounds to legislate against the practice should be the consequent harm, not the causal analysis that you have about the fact that these are grounded in some patriarchal scheme. If they're grounded in some patriarchal scheme, well, bad. But we should not make that a case for the banning of these practices. A lot of our arguments are of this variety. And this has to be seriously objected to, is what I feel.
Thanks, Ashwin. So then my sort of final broad question to you, where I want your thoughts, whether we look at it from a lens of traditions or just traditions as an instrument of social organization, right? I mean, like one of the constitutive things that make up how we organize our society and run it. I see that many times, whether we look at it from a liberal view or not, societies and societal norms have a lot of inertia, right? I mean, the circumstances might change. I mean, we've moved from a world where perhaps there was very little migration in large volume to a world where there is a large-scale migration within a country and beyond countries. And there are other, there's technology that's coming in, so you can connect with people, you can meet people who are from very different backgrounds from you. So when these kinds of social realities change, sometimes the social practices still stay stuck, right? And there's inertia that comes in. Indian society and many other societies also have very unequally distributed social capital. So there are problems that keep emerging out of this. So how do you see traditions evolving from within to sort of accommodate to new realities? As opposed to us coming from a liberal or some other rationalist view and saying, okay, these are all the problems in society in which they're failing and therefore we will fix it. Right? So if we remove that impulse out, do you see enough scope for change?
Maybe not, but at least this much has to be granted, right? That whatever change one is talking about has to be a part of a larger political ethic of conversation, right? That is, the participants, the parties to this change are parties to the conversation.
Right.
Otherwise, what you're really talking about is really a theology of progressive rationalism.
So are we missing out then on new social organizations or institutions that can even enable such conversations?
I think yes. The problem has been until now somewhat defined by the rationalist progressive perspective, and all these other retrograde forces of the society, regressive forces, these extreme reactionary forces of the society are just playing within that scheme. These two put together seem to be of the same piece, if you ask me, because the first step would be to say, how do you give some kind of flesh and blood to this sentiment that traditions are constitutive elements in our socialization? Another aspect there would be to say, if you were to ask a true card-carrying liberal, they would say that it is within the liberal rational imagination that all your traditions will be really protected. If you were to be in some kind of an illiberal frame, then there would be one tradition which would be protected, all right, but all other traditions will be smashed. So, in fact, the best caretaker of multiple traditions within a culture would be liberalism itself. Maybe that there's a lot of merit to that claim.
But for that to happen also, we need institutions where people agree to those norms, right?
So, of course, we need institutions which will sort of operationalize these norms. But what is also needed is a certain other endorsement or some kind of an acceptance that it is not enough to allow for multiple traditions to subsist. What is needed is for the multiple traditions to flourish. Now, that is the larger challenge that for some reason on the liberal side, no one would be interested in. And on the other side of the spectrum, no one seems to be bothered about, but for in a very militaristic way. So this is really a myopia of the liberal imagination, that you somehow assume that allowing for different traditions to subsist is a sufficient response for the fact that there are different pursuits of the good in society. You will need something more than a mere allowance. You will need an active recognition of the fact that these are worthwhile pursuits of the good, these specific traditions, for which we need to move out of this perspective about traditions which says the one time I'll be worried about traditions is when they are violating one or the other right that I have defined. That cannot be the vantage point from which we talk about traditions, because the real vantage point that one needs to be talking about is what are the different ways in which various traditions, legal traditions, customary traditions, ritual traditions, scientific traditions, constitute a certain social life, and how does one ensure the robustness and richness of all of those traditions, and only within that try and make a very minimalist argument based on the nature principle of harm and injury about what are the specific practices that need to be questioned or removed.
So it's like circumscribing the borders of some of these traditions and where they specifically violate certain basic principles and tenets.
Yeah, I think that should be, that would also give us a greater grip on this general philosophical idea that traditions are not these kind of things that one accesses. Yeah, that is, you're not customers of traditions. You are constituted by traditions as much as you constitute indirectly various traditions. So how do you look at these constitutive forces of a social order is something that we need to be really paying attention to, because, mind you, the roots of social order, the roots of social good are many and complex. One cannot assume that an explanatory theory about a specific aspect of a social order exhausts our knowledge of the social order. No, that can't be the case. It's a little bit like assuming that you may know very well what you should do, what drug works for what specific problem of your respiratory tract. Nevertheless, you should not assume that you have now exhausted the knowledge of the respiratory tract such that you can either replace it or you can make it fungible. That is not an option.
Absolutely. On that note, Ashwin, thank you so much for this illuminating conversation. As always, it's a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for joining me on the Pragati Podcast.
Thank you so much, Pavan. It's always a joy to be on Pragati.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
How many times have you motivated yourself to improve your sleep, or lose weight, or be more productive? How many times have you failed? Hi, my name is Ashwin Doctor. Tune into my show, The Habit Coach Podcast, where we focus on creating small, tiny habits to improve your life instead of those big, impossible tasks. So make listening to me a habit every Monday, Wednesday and Friday on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com or on your favorite podcasting app.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the storytellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Storysellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.